All right, everyone, settle in for tonight's exploration. We're veering off the well-trodden path of kings and popes and stepping into something a touch more unvarnished. Prepare for a deep dive, not into the divine beauty of a finished Gothic cathedral, but into the forgotten toil and the everyday peril of life for the men who built them in 13th century France. That glossy version of history you've seen in art books, all soaring vaults and transcendent light filtering through stained glass. Well, the unvarnished truth of its creation was a far cry, and frankly, your modern comforts would feel like a distant, unimaginable dream. So, find your coziest spot. If you appreciate a journey into the raw, unfiltered past, a like on the video would be fantastic, and do consider subscribing for more of these historical reality checks. As always, I'm curious to know where you're joining us from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and time. It's always a highlight seeing our global community. Okay, perhaps dim those lights. Let a soft ambient sound fill the room, and let's embark on tonight's rather sobering journey together. You are not an artist driven by divine inspiration. You are a young man who has left the back-breaking, predictable misery of the farm for the promise of a wage. You are a migrant laborer, drawn to the massive construction site of the new cathedral, a project that will last longer than your own lifetime. You have heard stories of the pay, the community of craftsmen, the chance to be part of something monumental. You arrive not at a place of serene worship, but at a chaotic, noisy and terrifyingly dangerous industrial zone. The soaring ambition of the cathedral is matched only by the crushing, earthly reality of its construction. Your journey towards God's house begins in the mud and the grime. The worksite is a controlled chaos, a symphony of clamor and peril. The air is thick with stone dust, the ground a treacherous landscape of wood shavings, discarded stone chips and deep pits of slaking lime. The sound is a relentless barrage, the rhythmic chip 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 of hundreds of masons' chisels, the grating scrape of saws on stone, the shouts of foremen, the creak and groan of wooden cranes, and the dull, sickening thud of a dropped tool or block of stone from a great height. There are no safety regulations, no hard hats, no protective gear. Death is a constant, casual presence, an accepted risk of the trade. Your first job is at the bottom of the hierarchy. You are a laborer. Your days are spent doing the most physically demanding and least skilled tasks. You carry heavy hods of mortar up rickety ladders. You haul buckets of water. You turn the massive windlass that powers a crane. But your most dreaded task is in the tread wheel. You and several other men are placed inside a gigantic wooden wheel, like hamsters in a cage. You walk and walk and walk for hours on end, your combined weight turning the axle that lifts enormous blocks of stone hundreds of feet into the air. It is exhausting, mind-numbing, and incredibly dangerous. If the wheel slips its moorings, you will be thrown around inside like a rag doll in a spinning drum. Let's say you show some aptitude and graduate from pure labor. You become a quarryman. Your life is now a brutal, percussive battle with the earth itself. You work in a massive pit, miles from the cathedral, splitting massive limestone blocks from the bedrock. Your tools are simple iron wedges, heavy hammers, and wooden lavers. You drive the wedges into the stone, exploiting natural fissures, praying for a clean break. The work is incredibly dangerous. A premature split can send shards of rock flying like shrapnel. A poorly secured block can shift and crush a man in an instant. The dust you breathe, thick with silica, begins its slow, silent work of turning your lungs to stone. From the quarry, you might move to the mason's lodge on the construction site. Here, you learn the art of shaping stone. You're a rough hewer, then a fine dresser. You spend 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, bent over a block of stone, your hammer and chisel your only companion. The work is precise and repetitive. You must follow the wooden templates provided by the master mason with exacting accuracy. A mistake can ruin a block that took weeks to quarry and transport, earning you a fine or a beating. The constant chipping motion sends jarring vibrations up your arms, and the fine stone dust fills the air, coating your skin, your clothes, and your lungs. The scaffolding that encases the rising cathedral is a terrifying skeletal forest of wood. It is made of uncut poles, lashed together with rope. The platforms you work on are simple wooden planks, often unsecured. There are no handrails. You work hundreds of feet above the ground, exposed to the wind, the rain, and the sun. A moment of dizziness, a gust of wind, a misplaced foot, and your life is over. You see men fall. It is a common occurrence. Their scream is a brief, sharp punctuation in the daily noise of the site. Their bodies are carried away, and another man takes their place. You learn to move with a cat-like caution, every step a calculated risk. The food you eat is basic and monotonous, designed for fuel, not pleasure. Your wage is paid daily, and a portion of it is immediately spent on your sustenance. The staple is a coarse, dark bread, and a thin, weak ale, which is often safer to drink than the local water. You might have a bowl of pottage, a vegetable stew, sometimes with a small piece of bacon or saltfish for flavor. You eat in a communal shed, a noisy, rough environment, where you guard your meager meal from your hungry comrades. This is the fuel for the 12 hours of hard labor you are expected to perform. Your living quarters are as crude as your diet. You sleep in the lodge, a long, hastily constructed wooden shed near the work site. You and dozens of other men sleep on straw pallets on the floor, packed tightly together for warmth. The lodge is drafty, smoky, and smells of sweat and unwashed body. Your personal possessions are few, stored in a small wooden chest at the foot of your pallet. Fights and thefts are common. This is your home for the duration of the building season, a temporary, uncomfortable, and often violent community of men, far from their own homes. The master mason is the god of this small universe. He is the architect, the engineer, and the general contractor, all in one. He designs the cathedral, often working from a small, private tracing house. He directs the entire operation, from the quarry to the final placement of the vaulted keystones. You, as a common mason, rarely speak to him. You receive your instructions from his foreman. He is a man of immense skill and knowledge, often literate, a member of a secretive and powerful guild. His genius will create a masterpiece for the ages, but it is built upon the anonymous sweat and blood of men like you. The mortar you use is a foul and caustic substance. The mortar mixers have one of the worst jobs on site. They take quick lime, which has been slaked or cured in deep pits for months, and mix it with sand and water. The lime is highly alkaline and burns the skin. The mixers are constantly covered in a white paste that irritates their skin and chaps their hands. The fumes from the slaking pits are noxious. They work in a cloud of dust and steam, their bodies caked in the very substance that will hold God's house together. Let's talk about the dust. It is your constant, invisible enemy. As a stonemason, you live in a cloud of fine silica dust. You breathe it in, hour after hour, day after day. It settles deep in your lungs. Over the years, it causes a condition the Romans knew as cutter's disease, what we would call silicosis. Your lungs slowly harden, turning to a useless, stone-like tissue. You develop a persistent, hacking cough. You become short of breath. You will likely die young, not from a dramatic fall, but from a slow, painful suffocation. Your body consumed from the inside by the very material you have dedicated your life to shaping. The great treadwheel crane is the most impressive piece of machinery on site, and the most terrifying. It is a massive wooden crane with a large wheel, sometimes 20 feet in diameter. You and your fellow laborers are the engine. You walk inside the wheel, your combined weight turning the axle that winds the rope and lifts the stone. The foreman shouts commands from outside. You cannot see the load you are lifting. You can only walk and pray. You pray that the rope, woven from hemp, does not snap under the immense strain. You pray that the pawl, the safety catch, holds. If it fails, the wheel will spin backwards at a terrifying speed, breaking the legs and bodies of the men inside. Injury is an accepted part of the job. A slipped chisel can gash your hand to the bone. A falling piece of wood can break your arm. A misplaced block of stone can crush your foot. There is no formal medical care. The master of the lodge might know some basic first aid. Wounds are washed with wine or vinegar and bound with rags. A broken bone is crudely set and splintered. If the wound becomes infected, as it often does, your fate is in God's hands. There is no sick pay, no compensation. If you cannot work, you are cast out, your place taken by the next desperate man from the countryside. The stained glass window makers are a class apart. They are highly skilled artisans, members of a secretive guild. They work not with stone, but with light and color. But their craft has its own dangers. They cut the colored glass with a hot iron, a process that can lead to severe burn. They join the pieces of glass together with strips of lead. They are constantly handling the lead, and they breathe in its fumes as they solder the joints. They suffer from lead poisoning, a slow creeping illness that causes abdominal pain, memory loss, and neurological damage. Even the creation of the most beautiful transcendent art has its earthly, toxic price. Winter brings its own kind of misery. When the weather turns too cold, the mortar will not set properly. Construction on the cathedral grinds to a halt for several months. For you, the migrant laborer, this is a disaster. The work stops, and so does your pay. You must find other work to survive the winter, or you must live on whatever meager savings you have accumulated. Many men are forced to beg or to return to their home villages in shame. The winter is a long, hungry, and uncertain time, a period of enforced idleness that is more stressful than the most dangerous work. The social life of the lodge is rough. You are a community of men without women, far from home. After the long day's work, the evenings are spent gambling with dice, drinking cheap wine or ale, and telling stories. Fights are common, often sparked by a dispute over a game, a debt, or a regional rivalry. A strict hierarchy is enforced by the lodge masters and the foreman. Justice is swift and often brutal. You learn to navigate this complex and often violent social world, to find your place in the pack. Your pay is meager, and it is often not paid in real currency. Many large construction sites operate a truck system. You are paid in specially minted tokens that can only be exchanged for goods at a store run by the Cathedral, chapter or the master mason. The prices at this store are of course inflated. This system ensures that most of your wages flow directly back to your employer. It is a form of debt peonage, designed to keep you tied to the work site, unable to save enough real money to leave. Let's imagine you are a carpenter. You build the complex wooden centerings that will support the stone vaults during their construction. This is highly skilled work, but it is also incredibly dangerous. You work high in the roof space, balancing on narrow beams. You build the massive, rickety scaffolding that clings to the side of the building, and you build the great wheels and crane. You are surrounded by the constant risk of a fall, or of being struck by a piece of falling timber. Your material is lighter than stone, but gravity is just as unforgiving. The guild system is both your protection and your master. As a skilled mason, you belong to a guild that sets standards, regulates wages, and provides a small measure of support for its members. The guild has its own secrets, handshakes, passwords, and geometric formulas, passed down through generations. It is a fraternity, but it is also a rigid hierarchy. You must progress from apprentice to journeyman to master, a process that can take many years, and the masters of the guild guard their power jealously. The religious aspect of your work is a complex issue. You are building a house for God, a monumental act of collective faith. The soaring space, the beautiful stained glass, the intricate carvings, all are designed to inspire awe and devotion. But for you on a daily basis, it is simply a job. It is a hard, dirty, and dangerous job. You might feel a sense of pride in your craft, in your contribution to this great work, but your more immediate concerns are your next meal, your aching back, and the loose plank on the scaffolding above your head. The divine purpose is often lost in the earthly struggle. The sheer scale of the project is difficult to comprehend. The cathedral will not be finished in your lifetime, or even in your children's lifetime. You are working on a structure that was begun by your grandfathers, and will be completed by your grandson. This gives you a strange sense of anonymity and timelessness. You are a single small cog in a massive, slow-moving machine. Your individual contribution will be lost, absorbed into the vast, collective enterprise. You are building a monument to eternity, but your own life is brutally short and largely unremembered. The masons have their own secret language of symbols. Each master mason, and sometimes each individual craftsman, has a personal mark. You carve this mark onto the stones you have drawn. It is a form of quality control, allowing the foreman to know who shaped which block. But it is also a mark of pride, a signature left for posterity, hidden away in the massive structure of the cathedral. It is a small, anonymous whisper across the centuries, a way of saying, I was here, I helped build this. The risk of fire is ever present. The cathedral is built of stone, but it is surrounded by a forest of wooden scaffolding. The roof structure itself is a massive, complex web of dry timber. The forest, a stray spark from a blacksmith's forge, or a worker's campfire, can ignite this tinder-dry wood, leading to a catastrophic blaze that can destroy decades of work in a single night. The Great Fire that ravaged Notre Dame in Paris in 2019 was a modern echo of a medieval builder's worst nightmare. The relationship between the craftsmen and the church authorities who are funding the project is often strained. The canons of the cathedral chapter want the work done as quickly and as cheaply as possible. The master mason and his guildsmen want to maintain high standards of craftsmanship and be paid a fair wage. This can lead to disputes, work stoppages, and strikes. You are caught in the middle, your livelihood dependent on the outcome of negotiations between powerful men. Let's talk about the glass. The vibrant reds and blues of the stained glass are created by adding metallic oxides to the molten glass, cobalt for blue, copper for red. The men who work at the glass furnaces are exposed to intense heat and noxious fumes. They handle the molten glass with a skill that is both beautiful and terrifying. The process is a form of alchemy, transforming sand and ash and metal into transcendent light.
but it is a dangerous and unhealthy art. The men who work on the vaulted ceilings are the most daring of all. They stand on a temporary wooden framework, hundreds of feet in the air, to place the final wedge-shaped keystone that will lock the entire vault into place. The removal of the wooden centering is a moment of supreme tension. Will the vault hold? Will the complex interplay of forces resolve as the master mason calculated? Sometimes they did not. The history of cathedral building is also a history of catastrophic collapses, of architectural miscalculations that cost hundreds of lives. The tools you use are powered by muscle and gravity alone. There are no steam engines, no electric motors. Every block of stone is lifted by the sweat of men in a treadwheel or by a team of oxen. Every cut is made by the force of a man's arm, swinging a hammer. This makes the scale of the achievement even more incredible. These massive soaring structures were built using the same simple technology that had been in use for centuries. It is a testament to the power of human labor, organization, and a terrifying indifference to the cost in human lives. The noise inside the partially built structure is a disorienting echo chamber. The sounds of hammers, chisels, and shouting reverberate off the bare stone walls, creating a deafening and confusing cacophony. There are no soft surfaces to absorb the sound. You live and work inside a grotto of noise, a place where it is difficult to hear warnings or to think clearly. The silence of the finished cathedral, a space designed for contemplative prayer, is born from a century of unrelenting industrial-scale noise. The local town that grows up around the cathedral site is a rough and tumble place. It is filled with taverns, brothels, and lodging houses catering to the massive itinerant workforce. It is a place of opportunity but also of crime and disease. The relationship between the transient cathedral workers and the permanent townspeople is often one of mistrust and conflict. You are an outsider, a necessary evil, a source of both economic activity and social disruption. The physical toll on your body is immense. By the time you reach the age of 40, if you are lucky enough to live that long, your body will be a wreck. Your joints will ache from a lifetime of hard labor and damp lodging. Your lungs will be scarred by stone dust. Your hands will be gnarled and misshapen. You will have a collection of poorly healed fractures and deep scars. You are an old man at an age we would consider to be early, middle age. Your body is a sacrifice laid on the altar of the great church. The Mason's Lodge is more than just a place to sleep. It is a self-governing institution. It has its own rules, its own traditions, and its own system of justice. It is a closed society, secretive and protective of its members and its craft knowledge. To be a member of the lodge is to be part of a brotherhood, but this brotherhood is also a rigid system of control dictating your work, your pay, and your behavior. Let's consider the gargoyles and grotesques that you or your fellow masons carve high on the cathedral walls. They are strange, often comical or demonic figures. Some historians believe they were a form of creative expression, a way for the anonymous craftsman to leave a personal, sometimes subversive mark on the sacred structure. They are a small earthly laugh in the face of divine seriousness, a reminder that this great house of God was built by flawed, humorous, and very human hands. The sheer duration of the project means that you will see architectural styles change during your working life. You might begin your career working in the solid, heavy style of the early Gothic, and end it by carving the delicate, flame-like tracery of the High Gothic. You are a participant in a slow-moving artistic evolution. You must learn new techniques, new ways of shaping stone, new engineering principles. You are a lifelong learner in the most demanding and dangerous school imaginable. The financing of the cathedral is a complex and often precarious affair. It relies on the donations of the wealthy, the tithes of the poor, and the sale of indulgences. If funding dries up, construction can halt for years or even decades. You can be laid off with no notice, your future uncertain. The cathedral's progress is a barometer of the region's economic and political stability. You are a skilled craftsman, but your livelihood is at the mercy of forces far beyond your control. The feeling of topping out a spire, of placing the final stone hundreds of feet in the air, must be a moment of incredible pride and terror. You are as close to heaven as you will ever be in this life. You can see for miles in every direction. You are standing on the pinnacle of a structure that has consumed the lives of generations. It is a moment of profound achievement, a testament to your skill and your courage. And then you must make the long, dangerous climb back down to the earth. The carvings you create are not just decorative, they are the Bible for the illiterate. You carve the stories of the Old and New Testaments, the lives of the saints, the allegories of virtue and vice. You are a storyteller in stone. Your work teaches, it inspires, and it warns. You may not be able to read the holy book, but you can read the language of stone, and you help to translate it for the common people who will come to worship in this space. The social life of the worksite is stratified. The quarrymen, the laborers, the masons, the carpenters, the glaziers. Each craft has its own lodge, its own hierarchy, its own sense of identity. There is rivalry between the guilds, but also a grudging respect. You are all part of the same great project, all contributing your unique skill to the collective whole. It is a complex, interdependent ecosystem of craft. The end of the day is a moment of profound relief. You lay down your tools, your body screaming with exhaustion. You wash the stone dust from your face and hands in a bucket of cold water. You join your comrades for a meager meal and a cup of ale. You talk, you complain, you gamble. You are trying to forget the dangers of the day, and to not think about the dangers of tomorrow. You are trying to feel like a human being again, if only for a few hours. The contrast between your life and the purpose of the building is immense. You live a life of earthly squalor, danger, and hardship. But you are building a structure that is designed to be a representation of the New Jerusalem, a gateway to heaven. It is a place of sublime beauty, of divine order, of transcendent light. This paradox is at the very heart of your existence. You are a sinner building a house for a saint, a mortal creating a monument for an eternal God. The moment a vault collapses is the ultimate nightmare. It is a sudden catastrophic failure of engineering. Tons of stone and wood fall in an instant, killing dozens, or even hundreds of men. The sound is a deafening roar, and the site is enveloped in a cloud of dust. It is a devastating setback, a tragedy that shakes the confidence of everyone on the site. And then after the bodies are cleared, the slow, arduous process of rebuilding begins again. The faith of the patrons is strong, and the supply of desperate laborers is endless. The stained glass windows are installed last. For years the window openings are covered with plaster or cloth. When the glass is finally put in place, it transforms the interior. The space, which was once a dark and cavernous construction site, is suddenly filled with a dazzling colored light. For you, the builder, it is a magical moment. You see for the first time the true, intended beauty of the space you have helped to create. It is a glimpse of the heaven you have been promised. The relationship between the masons and the carpenters is often one of friendly rivalry. The masons work with the eternal, unchanging material of stone. The carpenters work with the temporary organic material of wood. They build the scaffolding and the complex centerings that the masons depend on. There is a constant back and forth between the two crafts, a necessary collaboration to solve the complex geometric and engineering problems of the cathedral's construction. The danger of falling tools is a mundane but constant threat. A mason working high on the wall might drop a chisel. A carpenter might lose his grip on a hammer. For the men working below, this is a deadly rain. A small tool falling from a height of 200 feet can be lethal. You learn to listen, to be aware of the work happening above you, to anticipate the random deadly accidents that are an unavoidable part of your daily life. The concept of a work-life balance would be absurdly comical to you. Your work is your life. You live on the work site. Your entire social world consists of your fellow craftsmen. Your life is a monotonous cycle of work, eat, sleep, and if you are lucky, a few hours of drunken camaraderie on a Sunday. There is no escape, no vacation, no retirement. You work until you are too old, too sick, or too injured to continue, or until you make a fatal mistake. The final dedication of the finished cathedral is a grand and solemn affair. The bishop, the clergy, the nobility, and the townspeople gather for a magnificent ceremony. The space is filled with chanting, incense, and prayer. You stand at the back of the crowd, anonymous, your contribution unrecognized. You look at the soaring vaults, the jewel-like windows, the intricate carvings. You know every stone, every joint. This is your life's work, and yet it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to God, to the church, to the ages. You are simply a ghost in the machine you helped to build, and as you drift off to sleep tonight, warm, safe, and comfortable, look up at your smooth, solid ceiling. Think of the men who worked 100 feet in the air, on a single rickety plank, with no safety net. Think of the men who breathed in stone dust, until their lungs gave out. Think of the anonymous, forgotten craftsmen, who gave their health, their limbs, and their very lives to build the magnificent soaring monuments that we still gaze upon with a sense of wonder. They reached for heaven, but their own lives were a testament to the brutal, unforgiving, and very earthly realities of the medieval world.
The city was less a place of the present than a monument to its own past. By the middle of the 15th century, Constantinople was a ghost haunting the shores of the Bosphorus, a magnificent sprawling sepulchre of empire. Within its legendary triple-layered Theodosian walls, which had repelled invaders for 1,000 years, lay more fields and ruins than houses. The great forums where Roman emperors once addressed their people were now quiet, overgrown spaces. The aqueducts that had once supplied 1,000,000 souls with fresh water now served a dwindling population of perhaps 50,000. Yet, the ghost was a glorious one. At its heart still stood the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, its colossal dome seeming to float above the city, a testament to a faith and an engineering genius that the world still marveled at. This was the capital of the Roman Empire, or what remained of it, a Christian island in a rising sea of Ottoman power, and on this island reigned the last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos. He was a man born for a different era, a leader of courage and dignity who inherited a crown of thorns. He styled himself Emperor of the Romans, but his empire was little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. He presided over a court of intricate ceremony but empty coffers, a people fiercely proud of their heritage, but deeply divided by theological disputes, particularly over the recent, desperate union with the Latin Church in Rome in exchange for military aid that never fully materialized. Constantine was a realist. He saw the storm gathering across the water and he knew its name. Its name was Mehmed. Sultan Mehmed II was the storm made flesh. He was young, only 21 years old when he ascended the Ottoman throne for the second time, but his mind was a forge of ambition, intellect, and ruthless resolve. While others saw a boy, those who looked closer saw a man fluent in multiple languages, a student of classical history who read of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and who saw himself as their successor. From his earliest days, one obsession had consumed him: Constantinople. The city was more than a strategic prize. It was a prophesied conquest, the ruby apple of the world, the key that would unlock true imperial destiny. His father had tried and failed to take it. Mehmed would not. To him, the continued existence of this Christian city in the heart of his burgeoning empire was an intolerable anomaly, a bone stuck in the throat of the caliphate. The first move was a declaration of intent, cast not in words, but in stone and mortar. On the European side of the Bosphorus, directly across from a fortress built by his great-grandfather, Mehmed began constructing a new castle. He named it Rumel-i-Hisari, the throat cut. Its purpose was simple and brutal: to sever Constantinople's final maritime link to the Black Sea and any potential aid from its colonies there. Constantine sent envoys, protesting the violation of treaties. Mehmed's response was chillingly clear. He told them that the land beyond the city's walls was his, and his reach extended as far as his horses could tread, and his sword could swing. The construction was completed in a terrifyingly short span of months. From its towers, Ottoman cannons now commanded the narrow strait. Any ship attempting to pass without the Sultan's permission would be sent to the bottom. The noose was tightening. Within the city, a grim resolve took hold. Constantine XI oversaw the frantic preparations for a siege he knew was inevitable. He sent out desperate pleas to the Christian kingdoms of the West, to the Pope in Rome, to the merchants of Venice and Genoa. He offered humility, he offered concessions, but the response was tepid. Europe was preoccupied with its own conflict. The schism between the Eastern and Western churches had left a chasm of mistrust. While they debated and delayed, the Emperor of the Romans walked his city's ancient walls, inspecting the crumbling ramparts, organizing the meager defense forces, and trying to unite his factious people. A glimmer of hope arrived in the form of a Genoa soldier of fortune, a man whose name would become inextricably linked with the city's last stand: Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. He came with 2 ships and 700 heavily armed men, professional soldiers who knew the business of war. He was an expert in siege defense, and Constantine, recognizing his worth, immediately placed him in command of the land walls. Giustiniani's energy was infectious. He organized repairs, assigned positions, and instilled a sense of professional discipline among the mixed defenders, a motley crew of Byzantines, Venetians, and his own Genoa. They numbered no more than 7,000 fighting men in total, tasked with defending over 14 miles of fortifications against an army that would soon number over 80,000. As winter gave way to the spring of 1453, the main body of the Ottoman army began to appear on the horizon. It was a terrifying spectacle. An endless river of men, horses and camels flowed across the Thracian plains, followed by a logistical train of unprecedented scale. But it was not the sheer number of soldiers that struck the deepest fear into the hearts of the defenders watching from the walls. It was the sound that accompanied them, a low, groaning rumble that shook the very earth. It was the sound of the great guns. Mehmed, a keen student of military technology, had embraced the power of gunpowder. He had sought out a Hungarian engineer named Orban, a master cannon founder, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines. But Constantine, with his empty treasury, could not afford his price. Mehmed could. The Sultan gave Orban everything he needed, unlimited funds, materials and manpower. The result was a series of monstrous bronze cannons, the largest the world had ever seen. The flagship of this new artillery was the Basilica, a behemoth nearly 30 feet long, capable of firing a stone ball weighing over half a ton a distance of a mile. It took 60 oxen and hundreds of men to drag the monster into position. When it was finally aimed at the mightiest section of the Theodosian walls, the city held its breath. On April 6, the silence of the morning was shattered by a coordinated roar, as Mehmed's entire artillery park opened fire. The ground shuddered. The great stone ball from the basilica flew through the air with a deafening shriek, and smashed into the ancient rampart. The wall, which had stood for a millennium, cracked and crumbled. Dust and debris filled the air. For the defenders it was a moment of profound shock. Their legendary walls, the shield of Christendom, were vulnerable. What followed was a relentless, grinding routine of destruction and repair. By day, the Ottoman cannons would pound a section of the wall into a pile of rubble. By night, under the cover of darkness, Giustiniani and his men, joined by citizens, monks and even women, would work frantically to build a new makeshift barricade of earth, timber and stone. They were fighting a battle against time, attrition, and the terrifying new logic of gunpowder. Constantine was everywhere, a constant presence on the walls, encouraging the workers, consulting with Giustiniani, sharing the risks with his men. He had shed the imperial purple for the armor of a common soldier, his only distinction, the emblem of the double-headed eagle. The Sultan watched the daily bombardment with a mixture of frustration and admiration. The city was wounded, but its spirit was not broken. The defenders' resilience was far greater than he had anticipated. He launched several infantry assaults against the breaches, but each time, they were thrown back by the desperate courage of Giustiniani's men, fighting hand to hand amidst the ruins. The battle was not confined to the land wall. The city's survival also depended on the Golden Horn, the great natural harbor that flanked its northern side. Its entrance was protected by a massive iron chain, stretching from the city to the Genoese colony of Pera, on the other shore, preventing the Ottoman fleet from entering. Early in the siege, a small squadron of 4 Christian ships, 3 from Genoa, and 1 from the emperor himself, laden with vital grain and reinforcements, appeared from the Sea of Marmara. The entire Ottoman fleet, over 100 vessels, moved to intercept them. From the walls, the people of Constantinople watched in prayerful terror. What they witnessed was a miracle of seamanship and courage. The tall, heavily armed Christian galleons plowed through the smaller Turkish ships, their marines raining down arrows and Greek fire. They broke through the blockade and sailed to the safety of the Golden Horn, a stunning victory that sent a wave of euphoria through the besieged city. For Mehmed, the humiliation was immense. His admiral was beaten and nearly executed for the failure. The victory boosted the defenders' morale, but it also hardened the Sultan's resolve. If his ships could not sail past the chain, they would find another way into the harbor. It was then that he conceived of a plan so audacious, so contrary to the known laws of warfare, that it bordered on the fantastical. He would take his fleet overland. He ordered his engineers to construct a massive wooden road, a greased slipway of logs, running for over a mile from the shores of the Bosphorus, up and over the steep hill behind the Genoese colony, and down into the waters of the Golden Horn. Thousands of men and teams of oxen were put to the task. On the night of April 22nd, under the cover of darkness in the den of a diversionary cannonade, the incredible feat was accomplished. The Byzantines awoke the next morning to an unbelievable sight. A fleet of some 70 Ottoman ships, their sails unfurled as if sailing on land, now floating in their protected harbor. The psychological blow was devastating. The one area the defenders had considered secure was now a new front line. The city was now completely encircled, its walls besieged from both land and sea. Despair began to creep into the city like a slow poison. Food was becoming scarce. The constant bombardment, the lack of sleep, and the sheer hopelessness of their situation wore down the defenders. Yet, they fought on. They repelled attacks from the fleet in the Golden Horn, using Greek fire to turn the water itself into a weapon. They discovered and thwarted Ottoman attempts to mine beneath the walls in a deadly, subterranean war of tunnels and counter-tunnels. As the weeks turned into a month, then more, the city became a landscape of omens and portents. A strange dense fog, unheard of in late May, blanketed the city for days, which some interpreted as a sign that God was abandoning them. Then, during a lunar eclipse, the moon rose looking like a blood-red sliver, fulfilling a prophecy of the city's demise. The most terrifying omen came a few days before the end. A strange unearthly light was seen flickering around the dome of the Hagia Sophia. To the terrified populace, it could mean only one thing: the Holy Spirit, the divine protector of the city, was departed. In reality, it was likely an atmospheric phenomenon, but in the heightened emotional state of the siege, It was a death sentence. Mehmed, sensing the city was at its breaking point, decided to launch one final overwhelming assault. He offered the emperor a last chance: surrender the city, and he and his people would be allowed to leave unharmed, or he could become the governor of a Greek province under Ottoman rule. For Constantine, there was only one possible answer. He would not be the emperor to surrender the city of Constantine the Great. He replied with quiet dignity that he had no right to give away the city. He and his people had resolved to die in its defense. The night before the final attack, on May 28th, a strange and poignant peace fell over the city. The Ottoman cannons fell silent. Within the walls, a final solemn ceremony took place. Constantine gathered his commanders and nobles and gave a final, heartbreaking speech, not as an emperor to his subjects, but as a father to his children, urging them to fight for their faith, their families, and their home. Afterwards, a great procession made its way to the Hagia Sophia. In a moment of transcendent unity, the divisions that had plagued the city for centuries dissolved. Orthodox and Catholic, Byzantine and Venetian, Genoese and Greek, all gathered under the Great Dome to take communion together for the last time. It was the church's own funeral, a requiem for a 1,000-year-old world. After the service, Constantine rode to the palace for a final farewell to his household, asking their forgiveness for no longer being able to protect them. Then, he mounted his horse and rode to the walls to take his post, disappearing into the darkness to become a soldier once more. Just after midnight, on Tuesday, May 29, 1453, the attack began. The sound was apocalyptic. Every cannon fired at once, drums thundered, trumpets blared, and from all sides a chorus of 100,000 voices screamed their war cry. The assault came in waves. First came the irregular troops, the Bashi bazooks, a wave of poorly armed men sent forward to exhaust the defenders and absorb their ammunition. They were driven back with heavy losses. Then came the disciplined Anatolian regiments, who fought with greater skill, pressing hard at the breaches. They too were repulsed by Justinian's exhausted, but resolute men. For over 2 hours, the defense held. The Christians, fighting with the fury of desperation, were holding the line. But Mehmed had saved his best for last. He now unleashed his elite troops, the Janissaries. They were the finest infantry in the world, men raised from birth for war, fanatically loyal to the Sultan. They advanced, not with a wild charge, but with a steady, disciplined, inexorable rhythm, moving through the smoke and chaos like specters of death. The fighting at the main breach in the Lycus Valley reached a fever pitch. It was a maelstrom of steel, blood, and courage. Constantine fought alongside his men, a lion at bay. Justinian was a giant, his armor dented, his sword a blur, holding the breach almost single-handedly. It seemed, for a moment, that the impossible might happen, that the attack might be broken. Then, disaster struck. At the height of the battle, a shot from a culverin, a small cannon, pierced Justinian's breastplate. He fell, grievously wounded. The pain was unbearable, and he begged his men to take him from the field. His retreat, though understandable, shattered the morale of the Genoese defenders. At the same moment, a second stroke of misfortune occurred. A small, unsecured postern gate in the northern section of the walls, the Kirkoporta, was discovered by a handful of Ottoman soldiers. They poured through, overwhelmed the few guards, and raised the Ottoman standard on a nearby tower. The cry went up among the attackers: "The city is taken." Panic seized the defenders. Their lines, already stretched to the breaking point, wavered and then broke. The Janissaries surged through the breach, and the trickle of invaders through the Kirkoporta became a flood. The defense collapsed into a rout. Constantine saw what was happening. He saw his world ending before his eyes. According to the accounts of those who survived, he cast off his imperial regalia, wanting to die anonymously as a Roman soldier, shouting, "The city is fallen, and I am still alive." He drew his sword, and with the last of his loyal companions, charged into the oncoming sea of Janissaries. He was never seen again. In the chaos, the last Roman emperor was swallowed by the tide of conquest, his body lost to history, his end as heroic and tragic as the empire he led. The fall of the walls signaled the end. Chaos and terror descended upon the city. The sack, a traditional rite of a conquering army, began. For 3 days, a city that had been the light of the world for a millennium was plunged into darkness. Treasures were looted, libraries burned, and people were killed or enslaved. Sultan Mehmed II made his triumphal entry into the city in the afternoon. He rode not as a boastful conqueror, but with a sense of solemnity and awe. He had achieved his life's ambition, but the sight of the destruction and death tempered his joy. He rode directly to the Hagia Sophia. Dismounting, he entered the great church, stooping to scoop up a handful of earth and sprinkle it over his turban in a gesture of humility before God. He looked up at the magnificent dome, at the golden mosaics of Christ, and the Virgin Mary that shimmered in the light. He ordered the building to be preserved, but its purpose changed. An imam ascended the pulpit and recited the Islamic declaration of faith. The Church of Holy Wisdom became the Mosque of Hagia Sophia. The sound of the call to prayer replaced the chanting of Christian liturgy, a powerful symbol of the new order. The fall of Constantinople was more than the end of a city, it was the end of an era. It marked the definitive death of the Roman Empire, a continuous political entity that had stretched back to the time of Augustus. It solidified the Ottoman Empire as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean, and sent shockwaves throughout Christendom. The loss of the city and the closure of traditional trade routes to the east spurred European explorers like Columbus and Vasco da Gama to seek new sea lanes, inadvertently launching the Age of Discovery. The flood of Greek scholars fleeing the fallen city to Italy, carrying with them precious manuscripts and the knowledge of antiquity, helped fuel the intellectual fire of the Renaissance. A world had ended, and a new one had begun. The city of Constantine became Istanbul, the vibrant capital of a new and powerful empire. But beneath the minarets and the bustling markets, the memory of what was lost lingered. The ghost of Byzantium would continue to haunt the city, a whisper in the wind that blows across the Bosphorus, a silent testament to the 1,000-year empire that fell in a single, fiery day in May.
In the summer of 1845, the River Thames at Greenhithe was a scene of supreme confidence. Two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, sat anchored in the water, their freshly painted hulls gleaming black and gold. They were not merely vessels, they were declarations of intent, the very embodiment of Victorian England's industrial might and imperial ambition. They were bomb ships, built with reinforced frames to withstand the recoil of heavy mortars, now refitted for an even more formidable adversary, the crushing power of Arctic ice. They boasted steam engines salvaged from locomotives to turn screw propellers, an innovation to help them navigate treacherous ice flows. Their holds were packed with provisions for 3 years, a library of over 1,000 books, a hand-cranked organ, and the finest china for the officers' mess. They were, in the eyes of the Admiralty and the cheering public, invincible. Their mission was the stuff of legends, a geographical quest that had captivated Europe for centuries. The discovery of the final unnavigated section of the Northwest Passage. To find this sea road over the top of the world, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific, would be the crowning achievement of British exploration. At their helm was a man who was himself a living legend. Sir John Franklin, at 59, was a veteran of the sea. He had fought alongside Nelson at Trafalgar, survived shipwrecks, and charted vast stretches of the Australian coast. He was known as the man who ate his boots, a reference to a previous desperate overland Arctic expedition, where he had resorted to eating shoe leather to survive. Though some in the Admiralty worried he was perhaps too old, too slow for such a demanding command, his public stature was immense. He was a hero, a symbol of British fortitude, chosen to lead this grand final push into the unknown. His second-in-command, Captain Francis Crozier of the Terror, was a different sort of man, an Irishman of less distinguished birth. Crozier was arguably the more experienced polar sailor, a quiet, pragmatic veteran of 6 Arctic and Antarctic voyages. He knew the ice, its moods, its dangers, in a way few men did. On May 19, 1845, with pennants flying and crowds waving, the Erebus and Terror weighed anchor and sailed north. With them went 128 other officers and men, a hand-picked crew of Britain's finest. They were last sighted by a pair of whaling ships in late July, moored to an iceberg in Baffin Bay, waiting for the ice to clear enough to enter Lancaster Sound, the gateway to the passage. The officers were in good spirits, dining with the whaling captains, full of optimism. Then the ships sailed west, into the labyrinth of the Canadian Arctic archipelago, and vanished from the face of the earth. For 2 years there was no great concern in England. The expedition was expected to be long. Silence was part of the plan. But as the 3rd year passed with no word, a quiet unease began to creep into the public consciousness. This unease was most powerfully felt by one person, Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin. She was not a passive, grieving wife of Victorian convention. She was a force of nature, intelligent, relentless, and fiercely devoted. She began a campaign, writing letters, petitioning Parliament, and using her considerable social influence to pressure the Admiralty into action. The British public, captivated by the romance and the growing mystery, rallied to her cause. The search for Sir John Franklin was about to become one of the greatest manhunts in history. The first search parties were dispatched in what they found was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. On Beechy Island, a desolate spit of gravel at the entrance to the Wellington Channel, they discovered the site of the expedition's first winter camp from 1840. There were neatly stacked cairns of empty food tins, remnants of a blacksmith's forge, a laundry, and other signs of a well-disciplined crew passing a winter. Most chillingly, there were 3 graves, marked with wooden headboards, the final resting places of 3 young crewmen who had died during that first year. But there was no note, no letter, no message left in a cairn indicating Franklin's future plan. It was as if they had finished their winter, packed up, and sailed on. After this point, the trail went utterly cold. Years passed. Ship after ship, funded by the Admiralty and by Lady Franklin's own dwindling fortune, sailed into the Arctic maze. They found nothing. The empty white landscape offered no clues. The Arctic, it seemed, had simply swallowed the men and their ships whole. The first truly shocking breakthrough came not from a Royal Navy captain, but from a rugged Scottish doctor and explorer named John Rae, working for the Hudson's Bay Company. In 1854, while surveying the Boothia Peninsula, far to the south of where the main search was concentrated, Rae encountered a group of Inuit hunters. They had a story to tell. A few years prior, they said, they had met a group of about 40 white men, thin and desperate, dragging a boat and sledges southwards. They were traveling on foot, down the coast of a large island the Inuit called King William's Land. The men bought a small seal from the hunter. Later that season the Inuit found the bodies of some 30 men on the mainland, and 5 more on a nearby island. Some of the bodies were in tents, others lay where they had fallen. The scene was one of utter horror. The Inuit told Rae, through his translator, that from the mutilated state of the corpses and the contents of the cooking kettles, it was clear that these desperate men had resorted to the last, unthinkable taboo. They had been eating each other to survive. To prove their story, the Inuit sold Rae a collection of items they had found or traded from the dying men. There were silver forks and spoons, a medal and a small silver plate. They were all engraved with the name Sir John Franklin. When John Rae's report reached England, it was met with a storm of outrage. The notion that heroic British sailors, the pride of the Royal Navy, could have stooped to cannibalism was an intolerable stain on the national honor. The Victorian establishment, led by the influential author Charles Dickens, viciously attacked Rae, accusing him of believing the loose talk of savages. Lady Franklin refused to accept the story, clinging to the hope that her husband and his men had met a more noble end. The search had found its first real evidence, but it was a truth so terrible that society chose to reject it. Determined to find a more palatable version of events, Lady Franklin funded one last private expedition. In 1857, she sent out the steam yacht Fox, commanded by Captain Francis Leopold McClintock. He followed the clues from Rae's report, focusing his search around King William Island. It was here in 1859, nearly 15 years after the expedition had vanished, that McClintock made the discovery that would define the official story for the next century and a half. At a place called Victory Point on the island's northwest coast, he found a stone cairn. Inside was a small cylindrical container. Within it lay a single standard form Admiralty document. It was a note, with 2 entries written in the margins. The first, dated May 1847, was brief and optimistic. It stated that all was well, and that Sir John Franklin was in command. But written around it, in a different hand, was a second, far more desperate message, dated almost a year later, on April 20. The words scrawled in the cold told a story of catastrophe. It reported that the Erebus and Terror had been trapped in the ice since September of. It recorded the date of Sir John Franklin's death, June 11, 1847, just weeks after the first optimistic note was penned. It stated that the surviving 105 men under the command of Captain Crozier had abandoned the ships 3 days earlier and were now beginning a desperate march south, towards the Great Fish River, on the mainland. The note was signed by Crozier and Captain James Fitzjames, of the Erebus. It was the only written communication ever recovered from the expedition after it left Beechy Island. McClintock's party followed the trail of the dead. They found a skeleton in a steward's uniform, alone in the They found a lifeboat, mounted on a heavy sledge, pointing inexplicably back towards the ships. Inside were 2 more skeletons, along with a bizarre collection of items: silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, slippers, and numerous books. It was a pathetic cargo for men fighting for their lives in the world's harshest environment, a testament to their inability to let go of the world they had known. The ships themselves, however, were nowhere to be found. For the next 150 years, that was where the story stood. The Franklin expedition was a tragedy of heroic failure. Brave men, trapped by an unusually harsh turn in the climate, had died honorably while attempting to walk to safety. The Inuit stories of cannibalism were largely dismissed or downplayed. The mystery of what exactly went wrong, and where the 2 ships had come to rest, remained. The riddle began to unravel with the advent of modern science. In the 1980s and 90s, forensic anthropologist Owen Beatty exhumed the bodies of the 3 sailors buried on Beechy Island. The permafrost had preserved them in an astonishing state. Analysis of their tissues revealed shockingly high concentrations of lead. The source was quickly identified: the thousands of tins of canned food
a new technology at the time, that had been supplied to the expedition. The tins had been sealed with thick seams of lead solder, carelessly and hastily applied, which had almost certainly leached into the food. The crew, from the very beginning, was likely being slowly poisoned. Chronic lead poisoning would have caused debilitating physical weakness, cognitive decline, paranoia, and poor decision-making, explaining many of the expedition's bizarre choices and ultimate failure to cope. Further examinations of skeletons found along the line of retreat on King William Island revealed something else: knife marks and cut patterns, consistent with butchery. John Ray and the Inuit had been telling the truth all along. The final chapter of the mystery, the location of the ships, required a fusion of old knowledge and new technology. For decades, modern searchers had ignored the Inuit, but a new generation, led by the Parks Canada Underwater Archaeology Team, began to listen. They paid close attention to Inuit oral histories, stories passed down through generations that spoke of a large ship sinking in one specific area, and another drifting with the ice to a different bay. One crucial piece of testimony came from a modern Inuit historian, Louis Kamukak, who had spent a lifetime gathering the stories of his elders. He pointed the searchers to an area far from where they had been looking. In September 2014, using side-scan sonar in the area suggested by Inuit testimony, the search team found what they were looking for. There, resting on the seabed in shallow water, was a ship. It was upright, remarkably intact, a ghost from another time. It was identified as HMS Erebus. The news electrified the world. 2 years later, acting on another tip from an Inuit crew member of a research vessel, the team found the second ship. In a location the Inuit had long called Terror Bay, they found HMS Terror. It was in even more pristine condition, resting deeper in the frigid, preserving water. The masts were broken but still present, the windows were not shattered, and a wealth of artifacts was visible on the deck and inside the cabins. Plates were stacked neatly on shelves, scientific instruments lay on tables, and the ship's bell was still in place. It was a time capsule, a silent, frozen world. The discovery of the ships rewrote the end of the story. The location of the Terror, far south in Terror Bay and seemingly buttoned up for winter, suggested that a small group of survivors had managed to reman the ship, after the initial abandonment, sailing or drifting it to its final resting place, before they too succumbed. The Erebus had clearly been the site of a more desperate end, the place from which the final doomed march began. The mystery of the Franklin expedition is no longer about if, but about how. How did the final days unfold? What decisions did Captain Crozier, a man who knew the Arctic so well, make in those last, desperate months? The ships are now archaeological sites, their secrets being slowly and carefully coaxed from the depths. They tell a story far more complex than the Victorian narrative of heroic failure. It is a story of systemic disaster, a story of a flawed plan, fatally compromised technology in the form of lead-soldered tins, and an unshakable cultural arrogance that prevented them from learning from the Inuit people, the only ones who knew how to truly survive in that world. The Erebus and Terror no longer represent the hubris of an empire. They are solemn monuments to human fallibility, to the 129 men who sailed into the white emptiness, seeking glory and found a slow, cold, and terrible end. Their story is a haunting reminder that nature does not care for ambition or technology, and that the Arctic keeps its secrets long and well. The silence that fell over the expedition in 1845 has finally been broken, replaced by a deeper, more profound understanding of their tragic fate. A story whispered from the frozen graves on Beechy Island, from the scattered bones on King William Island, and from the two ghost ships resting silently in the dark, cold water below.
It began with a kind of magic. In the years just before and after the Great War, the world had fallen in love with a newly discovered element, a substance that seemed to defy the laws of nature. It was called radium. Discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie, it was a miracle substance that glowed with an ethereal, perpetual light, a captured star held in a jar. It was promoted as a cure-all, a source of boundless energy, a veritable fountain of youth. Radium was put into toothpaste, cosmetics, butter, and water tonics. It was the radiant, optimistic heartbeat of a new technological age. And for the young women of Orange, New Jersey, this magic offered an opportunity. The United States Radium Corporation had opened a studio on Alden Street, and it was hiring. The job was delicate, well paid, and considered glamorous. It was work fit for respectable young ladies. They were to become dial painters, applying a luminous paint called undark to the faces of watches and military instruments. This paint, a mixture of glue, water, and radium powder, would allow soldiers in the trenches of Europe to read their dials in the dark. The women were contributing to the war effort, earning more than their fathers, and gaining a newfound sense of independence. The studio itself was a place of camaraderie, filled with the cheerful chatter of dozens of girls. Dust motes, infused with the magical element, danced in the sunbeams slanting through the large windows. The girls would often amuse themselves by painting their nails, their teeth, or even their dresses with the glowing paint, arriving home at night as ethereal shimmering figures. They became known, affectionately, as the Ghost Girls. They were taught a specific technique to ensure their brushstrokes were fine and precise. It was called lip pointing. After dipping the camel hair brush into the crucible of glowing green paint, they were instructed to place the tip between their lips, using their tongue to shape it into a perfect point. Lip, dip, paint, again and again, hundreds of times a day. When they asked if the paint was safe, their managers assured them it was. Radium, they were told, was harmless. In fact, some doctors claimed it had medicinal properties. With every pointed tip, these young women were swallowing a small dose of poison, but they did it with the full, trusting faith of their generation. One of the first to take the job was a young woman named Molly Magia. She, like the others, was proud of her work, but a few years after she started, a strange ailment began. It started with a toothache. Her dentist pulled the tooth, but the socket refused to heal. Then another tooth became loose, then another. The pain was excruciating. Her jaw began to ache, and then crumble. The dentist, baffled, could remove pieces of her mandible with his fingers. Her breath took on a foul, putrid odor. Doctors were stumped. They diagnosed her with everything from rheumatism to syphilis, staining her reputation as her body fell apart. In September of 1922, Molly Magia died a horrific death. Her lower jaw had disintegrated completely, and the hemorrhaging from her mouth was unstoppable. Her death certificate listed the cause as syphilis. It was a lie, but it was a convenient one. Soon other ghost girls began to sicken. Grace Fryer, another dial painter, experienced severe back pain and trouble with her feet. Others suffered from debilitating anemia, crippling joint pain, and jaw bones that became so brittle they would fracture without warning. A grim pattern was emerging, a shared nightmare connecting the women who had once laughed together in the sunlit studio. They went from doctor to doctor, but none could provide an answer. The company, US Radium, flatly denied any connection between their illnesses and the work. They insisted the radium was safe. Privately, however, the company knew better. The very discovery of radium had been a tale of caution. Marie Curie herself suffered from radiation burns, and scientists handling the substance used lead shields and tongs. The executives and chemists at US Radium did not handle the material with their bare hands, and they certainly did not put it in their mouths. They commissioned internal reports which confirmed the dangers, but these reports were deliberately suppressed. When independent doctors began to suspect a link, the company paid for countervailing studies, designed to muddy the waters and discredit any physician who dared to suggest their product was to blame. They were engaged in a lethal and cynical cover-up. The turning point came not from a corporation, but from the dogged determination of the victims themselves, and one principled man of science. Grace Fryer, a woman of remarkable resolve, refused to accept the company's denials. She spent 2 years searching for a doctor who would take her seriously. Finally, she found Dr. Harrison Martland, the chief medical examiner of Essex County. Martland was a brilliant and incorruptible pathologist. He was skeptical at first, but as he examined more of the women, he became convinced. He developed a new and sophisticated theory. The radium, ingested through the lip pointing, was chemically similar to calcium. The body, mistaking it for a nutrient, was depositing it directly into the bone. Once lodged there, the radium did its deadly work. Unlike a chemical poison that might be flushed from the body, radium had a half-life. It was a perpetual engine of destruction, firing off tiny alpha particles that ripped through the surrounding bone marrow and tissue, riddling the women's bodies from the inside out. It was, as Martland described it, like having a tiny, continuous machine gun firing inside your bone. To prove it, he devised a grim experiment. He took one of the ailing women into a dark room with a special screen and a microscope. In the pitch black, he could see the faint flashes of light coming from her breath, the alpha particles escaping her body. He then exhumed Molly Magia's body. Her bones, even a year after her death, still glowed. They were so radioactive they could expose a photographic plate. Armed with this irrefutable proof, Grace Fryer set out to find a lawyer. It was another near impossible task. At least a dozen attorneys turned her down, unwilling to take on a powerful corporation with its army of lawyers and deep pockets. The case seemed unwinnable, and the statute of limitations for workplace injury had long since passed for most of the women. Finally, in 1927, a young idealistic lawyer from Newark, named Raymond Barry, agreed to take the case. He saw not a lost cause but a profound injustice. 5 women,
Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and sisters Quinta MacDonald and Albina Larice became the plaintiffs. They were suing U.S. Radium for $250,000 each. By the time the case was set to be heard, they were so ill that none could raise their arms to take the oath. They were dying, their bodies twisted in pain, their bones crumbling. The company knew that. Their legal strategy was one of cruel attrition, delay. They filed motion after motion, requested endless adjournments, hoping their accusers would simply die before they ever had their day in court. But the story had captured the attention of the press. The sensational journalist Walter Lippmann championed their cause, dubbing them the Radium Girls. Their plight, the image of these vibrant young women being eaten alive by the very substance that had once made them glow, horrified the nation. Public opinion swung massively in their favor. The judge, pressured by the outcry, refused to grant further delays. The case would proceed. The courtroom became a theater of pathos and science. The women, frail and wrapped in blankets, gave their testimony. When one was asked to demonstrate the lip-pointing technique, the simple, innocent gesture sent a shudder through the gallery. Dr. Martlin presented his damning evidence. U.S. Radium's defense began to crumble. Facing a certain and public defeat, the company suddenly offered to settle in the spring of 19. The terms were modest. Each woman would receive $10,000 and a $600 a year annuity for as long as they lived, plus all medical and legal expenses. None of them would live for very long, but in accepting the settlement, the company was forced to concede liability. It was a monumental victory. They had won, but the story was not over. In another town, Ottawa, Illinois, a different company, the Radium Dial Company, had been running a similar studio, and their girls were also dying. The Illinois chapter of the story was, in some ways, even more. The company fought harder, the denials were fiercer, and the local community, dependent on the factory for jobs, was often hostile to the women seeking justice. Here the fight was led by a woman named Catherine Wolfe, who would later be known by her married name, Donna. When she and her colleagues tried to bring a case, they faced the same stonewalling and denial. The company's president, Joseph Kelly, publicly insisted the substance was safe, even as his own company doctor was diagnosing the women with radium poisoning and telling them not to make their findings public. The Illinois case dragged on for years. The key moment, Catherine Donahue, emaciated and deathly ill, was carried into the courtroom on a stretcher to give her testimony. Her lawyer, Leonard Grossman, knew that proving the radium was in her body was the key. He arranged for a dramatic, in-court demonstration. An expert witness brought a Geiger counter, a device that could detect radioactivity. As he brought the instrument close to Catherine's body, it began to click, slowly at first, then faster and faster, the sound filling the silent courtroom. It was the sound of her own bones crying out, testifying to the poison that lay within. The Radium Girls won their case in Illinois as well. Catherine Donahue died a few months later, but not before she and her fellow workers had secured their victory. Their legacy, however, would outlive them all by generations. The fight of the Radium Girls was a landmark in the history of labor rights and public health. Their ordeal made it horrifically clear that workers needed protection from occupational hazards, even those that were invisible and poorly understood. Their court cases established legal precedents that allowed individual workers to sue their employers for damages due to work-related illnesses, a right that had not previously existed. The public outcry, and the scientific evidence they brought to light, led directly to the establishment of stronger industrial safety standards. Eventually, their struggle would contribute to the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, the federal agency tasked with ensuring safe working conditions for all. The story of the Radium Girls is a tragic tale of corporate greed and scientific ignorance, but it is more profoundly a story of incredible courage. It is the story of ordinary women who, faced with a death sentence, refused to be silent. They fought not just for themselves, but for a principle. They used their own decaying bodies as evidence, their fading breaths as testimony. The glow that had once been a novelty, a party trick, became a symbol of a dark truth. But in their fight, they transformed that glow one last time, turning it into a beacon of justice that continues to protect workers to this day. They were the Ghost Girls, and their story, written in their very bones, refuses to be forgotten.
The Lamb of God in the Salt Mine. The story of the Ghent altarpiece, deep beneath the Austrian Alps. In the cold, damp darkness of the Altasee salt mine, the history of Western civilization lay sleeping. It was May of 1945. The war in Europe was shuddering to its violent conclusion. But here, 1,000 feet underground, in tunnels that had been carved out over centuries, another battle was being fought, It was a race against time, waged not with guns, but with flashlights and quiet urgency. American soldiers, members of the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program, moved carefully through the labyrinthine chambers. All around them, stacked on wooden racks and leaning against the salt-weeping walls, were the stolen dreams of a continent. Vermeer's The Astronomer, Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna, countless tapestries, priceless manuscripts, and mountains of gold. And at the heart of it all, carefully crated and lying in the subterranean gloom, was the prize Hitler coveted above almost all others. It was not a weapon or a jewel, but a work of art so profound, so influential, that its theft was considered a wound to the soul of Europe. It was the Ghent altarpiece, the adoration of the mystic lamb. The Monuments men knew it was here. They also knew the mine was rigged with 8 500-kilogram aerial bombs, set by a fanatical Nazi official, with orders to detonate everything should the Reich fall. In this cold, silent tomb, the fate of a 600-year-old masterpiece hung by a thread. To understand why this collection of painted oak panels was worth risking so much, one must travel back through time, to a different world. A world of burgeoning cities, of fervent faith, and of an artistic revolution that was changing the way humanity saw itself. We return to the city of Ghent, in the Duchy of Burgundy, in the early. It was a bustling center of commerce and craft, a city of wealthy merchants and powerful guilds. One of these men, a civic leader and churchwarden, named Jodocus Vide, commissioned a grand politique altarpiece for his private chapel, in what was then the Church of St. John the Baptist. The commission was given to a master painter named Hubert van Eyck. The work was to be monumental, a complex, theological statement about the redemption of mankind, but Hubert would not live to see it completed. Upon his death, the immense task fell to his younger brother, Jan van Eyck, and it was Jan, a man who was as much an alchemist as an artist, who would ensure the altarpiece became a turning point in history. Jan van Eyck did not invent oil painting, but he perfected it to a degree that seemed miraculous to his contemporary. By mixing his pigments with linseed and other oils, he created a medium that was luminous and slow-drying. This allowed him to work with a level of detail that was previously unimaginable. He painted with tiny brushes, sometimes with a single hair, building up translucent glazes of color, one on top of the other. The result was a breathtaking realism. Light seemed to fall on fabric, reflecting off the polished surface of a jewel or the shimmering water of a fountain. He painted not just what he saw, but the very air and light that surrounded it. When the altarpiece was finally unveiled in 1432, it was a revelation. 12 panels in total, hinged to be opened and closed. When closed, it depicted the Annunciation in subtle grisaille tone, but when opened on feast days, it exploded with color. The upper register showed God the Father enthroned, flanked by the Virgin Mary and John the Baptist, with choirs of singing angels, and in the corner panels, starkly realistic nudes of Adam and Eve. The lower register was a single, panoramic landscape, a verdant paradise where saints, prophets, martyrs and pilgrims converge from all corners of the earth to adore the Lamb of God, standing on an altar, its blood flowing into a chalice, a symbol of the Eucharist and Christ's sacrifice. Every detail was imbued with meaning. The pearls on God's mitre, the individual species of plants in the meadow, the light glinting off a knight's armor, all were rendered with a precision that blurred the line between painting and reality. It was a window into a divine world, and it immediately became one of the most revered objects in Christendom. It was Ghent's greatest treasure, a source of immense civic pride. But to possess such a treasure is to invite danger. For the next 500 years the story of the altarpiece would be one of creation battling against destruction, of reverence clashing with greed. The first great threat came with the fury of the Reformation. In 1566, a wave of iconoclasm swept through the Low Countries. Protestant mobs, believing religious imagery to be idolatrous, stormed churches, smashing statues and burning paintings. As the mob approached Ghent, the altarpiece's guardians frantically disassembled its 24 panels and hid them, some accounts say in the rafters of the church tower. It narrowly escaped being hacked to pieces or put to the torch. 2 centuries later, a new kind of threat emerged, one born of revolution and imperial ambition. After the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte sought to centralize the world's greatest art in his new museum in Paris, the Louvre. In 1794, French troops occupying Ghent seized the 4 central panels of the altarpiece and shipped them to Paris. There they were put on display, trophies of a new empire. The side panels, the wings, were hidden by the city. After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the Duke of Wellington personally intervened to ensure the central panels were returned to Ghent, and the masterpiece was made whole once more.
but its troubles were far from over. A few years later, the 6-wing panels were sold by a corrupt church official and eventually ended up in the collection of the King of Prussia. For a century, the altarpiece remained divided, its heart in Ghent and its wings in a Berlin museum. It was the Treaty of Versailles, at the end of the First World War, that finally reunited them. As part of Germany's war reparations, Article 2047 of the treaty specifically demanded the return of the panels to Belgium. The reassembled altarpiece was celebrated as a symbol of national restoration. The piece, however, brought its own peculiar drama. On a damp night in April 1934, in one of the most audacious art thefts in history, a single panel was stolen from the cathedral. It was the lower left panel, depicting the just judges and the Knights of Christ. A few weeks later, the Bishop of Ghent received a ransom note demanding 1 million Belgian francs. To prove he had the panel, the thief, who signed himself DUA, detached the back half of the panel, a smaller painting of John the Baptist, and left it in a train station locker. But he would not get his money. The authorities refused to negotiate. A series of taunting letters were exchanged, and then silence. The main panel of the Just Judges was never seen again. The prime suspect, a local stockbroker named Arsène Godertier, suffered a heart attack at a political rally, and on his deathbed, whispered to his lawyer that he was the only one who knew where the panel was hidden. He died before he could reveal the location. To this day, the original panel remains missing. A meticulous copy now sits in its place, a constant reminder of the unsolved mystery. This theft was but a prelude to the greatest existential threat the altarpiece would ever face. As Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, his failed artistic ambitions curdled into a fanatical obsession with controlling the art of Europe. He planned to build the world's greatest museum, the Führer Museum, in his hometown of Linz, Austria. And at the heart of this collection, he wanted the Ghent altarpiece. He saw it not as a Belgian masterpiece, but as a supreme expression of the Germanic spirit, created by artists of German blood. When Germany invaded Belgium in May 1940, the altarpiece was in mortal danger. A frantic plan was hatched by Belgian officials to save it. They packed the 12 panels into crates and sent them on a truck towards the Vatican, seeking neutral sanctuary. But the journey was chaotic. As France collapsed under the Blitzkrieg, the truck was diverted to the Château de Pau, in the south of France, in what would soon become Vichy territory. There it seemed, it might be safe. It was a false hope. The Nazis had established a special unit, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, or ER, dedicated to the systematic looting of art from occupied territories. They knew exactly where the altarpiece was. For 2 years, German officials, including Hermann Göring himself, applied relentless pressure on the Vichy French government. In 1942, the French capitulated. Under the guise of taking it into protective custody, the Nazis seized the altarpiece. Its journey into the heart of the Third Reich began. It was taken first to the Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, a fairy tale fortress that had become a central depot for looted art. Then, as Allied bombing raids intensified, the Nazis moved their most precious treasures to a more secure location, the vast stable and dry tunnels of the Alto Sea salt mine. Here, with thousands of other masterpieces, the Lamb of God was laid to rest, awaiting its role in Hitler's thousand-year Reich. Which brings us back to May of 1945, and the tense race unfolding in the darkness beneath the mountain. The monument's men, led by Captain Robert Posey and Private Lincoln Kirstein, knew they had to act fast. The local Nazi Gauleiter, August Eichgruber, was a fanatic determined to follow Hitler's Nero decree, in order to destroy all German infrastructure and cultural heritage, rather than let it fall into Allied hands. He had ordered the bombs placed and was intent on their detonation. The salvation of the Ghent altarpiece, and everything else in the mine, came from an unexpected source, the local Austrian miners. These men, who had been forced to haul the art into the tunnels, felt a sense of custodianship. They could not bear to see these treasures, or their own livelihood, destroyed. In a remarkable act of sabotage, they secretly removed the original powerful bombs and replaced them with smaller, less effective demolition charges. On the final days, when Eichgruber ordered the mine sealed and blown up, the miners risked their lives to block the tunnel entrances with controlled rockfalls, preventing access and disrupting the demolition plan. They saved the art. When the monument's men finally entered the main repository, the sight was overwhelming. George Stout, a conservator and one of the program's leading figures, personally supervised the handling of the Ghent panels. With reverence, they uncrated the masterpiece. In the dim glow of their lamps, the brilliant colors of Van Eyck, muted by a thin layer of salt dust, shone once more. God the Father, the Virgin, the Lamb, they had survived. They had outlasted iconoclasts, emperors, thieves, and a genocidal dictator. The journey home was triumphant. The altarpiece was flown on a C-47 transport plane to Brussels, where it was greeted by cheering crowds and the Belgian royal family. On its return to Ghent, it was reinstalled in the cathedral, a potent symbol of a nation's and a continent's survival and rebirth. Today, the Ghent altarpiece resides in a special, climate-controlled glass enclosure within St. Bivou's Cathedral. It has undergone extensive restoration, painstakingly removing centuries of dust and discolored varnish to reveal the shocking vibrancy of Van Eyck's original color. It still draws pilgrims, though now they are pilgrims of art as much as of faith. It stands as a testament to the enduring power of human creativity. Its story is a microcosm of our own history, a reflection of our highest aspirations and our darkest impulses. It has been coveted, dismembered, stolen, hunted and nearly annihilated. Yet, through it all, the mystic lamb remains, its gaze serene, a survivor of the long dark night, forever adored in a meadow of eternal green.